here's what we are going to talk about today. We're going to get into account-based marketing, demand gen, defining those things, talking about how they relate to the double funnel. We're also going to throw in account-based strategy thing in there to define for you. Then we're going to talk about, like, are there specific programs that you do on just an ABM side or the demand gen side? Are they all kind of the same and you can do everything for, across both? We'll give some examples. I've got a couple stories to talk about. Then we're going to get into measurement. How do you measure this? So if you've got these two sides of the funnel, what are some important things to think about as you're thinking about measuring? We'll kind of end with how do you get the right balance of these two, but we'll really end with marketing dad jokes. So make sure you stay till the end, because Chris and I are going to go back and forth a little bit, try and make each other laugh with some really, really horrible marketing dad jokes. All right. So here's the thing, and I want everyone to really get this, like, really seed this in. There's no shared definition of either of these things. So there's no shared definition of ABM or demand generation. You can't go to a dictionary and like see exactly what they are. If you ask 8 different marketers, you're probably going to get 8 different responses. But there are some, there's some generally accepted principles across these things, and I'll talk about those a little bit. Chris will add to it. And then I'm going to frame us up into the definitions that we're going to use for today's conversation. So ABM, I feel like, is a little bit easier to explain or to define than demand generation. So ABM, you're creating a target account list of accounts where you have an unfair advantage with your differentiated technology, and you're likely to have like much better success with these accounts than others, maybe even in your ICP. You're adding all kinds of intelligence, data and intelligence to that list so that you really understand who the absolute best prospects are. And then you're taking them through a full funnel approach. Usually these are higher priced things that you're selling with longer sales cycles and with pain points that oftentimes people may not even know they have yet. So you're taking them through an entire journey through like just understanding your pain, getting to solutions and all that. Now, on the demand gen side, I'm going to give you 2 definitions just to confuse you even more. So I'm going to give you my definition of it, and then I'm going to give you the more shared, like, accepted definition of demand gen. So I think about demand gen as an umbrella term, because if I think about demand, if you look up now, you can look up demand in the dictionary, and it talks about desire. So it's like desire of a purchaser for your product. And so if I think of demand generation, I'm trying to generate desire for my product. Well, the way I think about it, that's how I market. I market by trying to create desire. I'm trying to make my product or my service look better than my competitors. I'm trying to make it very clear how people are going to get value from my product. And so so I think of it as an umbrella term. Most everything I do in marketing, at least from my perspective, is demand generation. Now, the more, I'd say, generally accepted definition of demand generation is one where it's a higher volume play. You maybe use it more when you've got a lower ASP, maybe in like a PLG, you're using primarily demand gen activities. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to call demand gen like our volume lead-based play through a funnel, and we're going to call ABM like that account-based, higher quality, lower numbers of accounts that we're addressing and taking them through a full funnel. Chris, I just talked a lot. Talk a little bit about account-based strategy and maybe add to any of the definitional items here.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll add to that, Jason, as marketers, we have never been known to use buzzwords or create buzzwords. So this is certainly not the case here, but in many instances, things are used interchangeably to the parent-child conversation. We see a lot of times demand gen may include account-based, and sometimes we even refer to it as volume and velocity to get at what we're talking about, like the North Pole, South Pole. I love having contrast and a big difference. But one big thing with account-based strategy, we're really trying to use that terminology, me especially. Like, I've geeked out on this. Some of the folks I've worked with, we geek out on this a lot. And working across sales and marketing leaders, we cannot solely think about marketing. And that's one of the things that triggers me a little bit. Like I am a bit of a curmudgeon, right? Like I get a little irritated when some people define account-based marketing as primarily top of funnel and advertising and some of the things that aren't stretching through to sales, which may come up in a dad joke later. But we have to connect to sales development and sales. So when we talk about account-based strategy, I use that as a blanket term to include the entire funnel and say that when we are pursuing a valuable set of accounts where we have agreed that there's prioritization, I don't care what your job title is, we should care about pipeline, opportunities, closing that business, creating engagement, all the things that we'll talk about today. So that's kind of my rant on this. It doesn't necessarily matter to me if it's demand gen or volume and velocity or account-based or ABM. Like I'm not going to flag people and be like, you shouldn't say ABM. But when I say account-based strategy, it is a dramatic overcorrection to make sure that we're talking about the integration and working together.
Awesome. Also, I'll pause here for 1 second before we move to the next slide. If you've got any questions that you want us to address, hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end. Just put them into the Q&A box. It's just Chris and I on here kind of moderating. I don't have a producer next to me like moderating the questions, so it may take us a second to get to them. But yeah, just pop them in there and we'll get to them for sure. Okay, so this is just a quick visual that can help just to help us ground us in like the polar ends of these two things, right? So when you're talking about demand generation, your market is usually broad versus on the account-based side, you're more narrow. I mean, this stuff isn't rocket science. With your ACV, like I talked about earlier, on the demand gen side, it's lower than on the ABM side. And the complexity of your sale or the complexity of understanding what they're buying, on the demand gen side, a little easier, on the account-based side, a little harder. Now, if you took this just as gospel, then you'd say, well, maybe some of you would say, well, I've got a very narrow market. I sell for like $250,000 a year, and it's incredibly complex. So should I only be doing ABM? No. So let's just make sure that's clear. We're not saying that you should align yourself with one of these and go to that side. This is just kind of like the polar opposites of how to understand these things. But I think what you'll see is Chris and I believe that everybody should be doing both. B2B companies should be doing both. It's just what's the right mix for your company. So let's talk about how this fits then into the double funnel, which TOPO, now Gartner, came up with. I don't know how long ago was it, Chris? A year and a half ago, 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's all a blur. That's probably right. Like let's say a year and a half. We'll go with that. Nice.
So the way, and I'll have Chris talk through it a little bit, but when you first see it, it looks like it's a pretty simple diagram. But I remember, I've been doing marketing for a long time. And when I first saw it, it just opened my eyes up. And sometimes that's happened. You just need a basic visual to like really get that point across to yourself. And so what I like to think about here, and the way it makes me think about this is usually when a company is deciding to do like, okay, we're doing a bunch of demand gen, or we're doing stuff, now we want to do account-based marketing. They flip to it and they measure everything on the account-based side the same way they were doing it when they were doing it before. And not only are they measuring it the same way, but they are using the previous benchmarks to also judge how good or bad the new ABM program is doing. When in fact, and you'll see we've got some benchmark data in here from Gartner, they have wildly different conversion rates, different volumes, different behaviors. And so when I saw this, and that's exactly what I was doing when I first saw this visual, I was doing that exact same thing. I was like, we were measuring our account-based stuff on a very lead-focused measurement funnel, I'll say, and didn't split it in two, even though we were absolutely doing more high volume based demand gen activities and more focused ABM activities. Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, a couple quick things. I'll be honest about this too. Like I'll share some of the epiphany moments and frankly, things that we skipped over. So years ago, multiple years ago, even before we created Double Funnel, the double funnel was alluded to. It's been talked about, right? Like when we're doing account-based, multiple go-to-markets, demand gen, volume and velocity, whatever we want to call it. It's been alluded to. The thing that became problematic, and we saw this with a ton of high-growth clients, no matter how targeted our demand generation is, and we have some benchmarks we'll share to Jason's point, we still have account base that's starting to pop up in more and more organizations as we embrace that. And Linda, we see your question about the ABM pilot. We will certainly answer that question, so don't worry about that. We see that a lot of folks actually overcorrected. And to your point, Jason, they were measuring things in a similar way, but we also had all these other metrics that only existed for account-based that were standalone. So it was difficult to tell the connective story of our go-to-market strategy. Like, what are we doing? Well, we have account-based, we have demand generation. Let's call those our big buckets, and we can start to segment underneath them. But we were trying to align that. This was one of the big things. Like, I love stage-by-stage conversion. I do not like calculating everything on our top number and using that and just having the percentages. Like, I want to know from stage 1 to stage 2, what conversion rate should we expect? I like measuring things in a linear fashion. So first, when we created this, we were literally trying to align the account-based funnel with the traditional marketing funnel, which is not glamorous or sexy or exciting. Like, we're used to lead to MQL, to SQL, to opportunity to close one, like whatever we want to call it. We're used to that. Yep. We wanted to align account-based where we could start to see, as we progress through the funnel side by side, how do these compare? And that was the epiphany. It was the side by side, which when we get to one of the benchmark slides later, we'll call attention to that. But Craig Rosenberg, co-founder of TOPO, I mean, he literally said, like, yes, we know this isn't rocket science, and this should feel simple to everyone, but the epiphany is when we start to measure things and put them beside each other. So Jason and I will talk about that more. As Jason said, you will get the slides. You can take screenshots too, but that's the big thing I want to stressing through. We want to measure throughout the entire funnel for every slice of data we can get, and we want to align all of our go-to-markets. That's the big push that we're trying to create here. And, I did see one great question pop up. Let's just address this. I go rogue, Jason.
Let's do it.
In mind here. There was a great question.
John McTighe. Hey, John.
Great question about why do a lot of these end at closed one. And, frankly, the reason that this ends at closed one for double funnel is we wanted to benchmark it. So we stopped at closed one on this, but we know that closed one is not the end. I mean, we have tons of accounts that work primarily account-based for existing accounts. And, I had a call with one yesterday, almost 90% of their expected revenue is going to come from existing accounts. So to the great question, which was about why do a lot of diagrams always end with closed one, this is an artificial end. This is us kind of saying, here's the first measure of success. But then we know when we're doing account-based for existing accounts, we are going to have loops. We are going to come back to this. We're going to have multiple opportunities at the same account. So that was a great one, which needs to be addressed because we don't think about this as our end, our high five, like let's never talk about it again.
Yep. Yes, I agree. And John, that was a good point. I mean, I even had that in one of my notes in a slide above, which is this doesn't end at acquisition. It goes all the way through the rest of that funnel. I think most companies, though, when they first start out, they definitely think about it from the acquisition standpoint, and they probably nail that first, and then they start to figure out, okay, how do we then apply this to the rest of the funnel, really, which goes all the way to renewal. Cool. Okay, we got a poll for you. So those of you who are multitasking, come on back now and answer this poll for us. Now, I've never done a link this isn't LinkedIn. What is this? Zoom poll. So I apologize if this doesn't work well. And of course, where are my polls? Damn it. It said polls earlier, now it's gone. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 tactics or activities. And what we want you to do is tell us, do you think they're ABM tactics, demand gen tactics, or both? So here's the first one. Hopefully you can see this. Organic social media can actually, and let's see. So organic social media, what we're talking about is like just you posting on LinkedIn, talking about giving advice, ideally not talking too much about our own products and being too salesy, growing our network. So that's kind of what we're talking about with organic social. Even from the company standpoint, so if you're using your company's account to post, respond, all those kinds of things. So we've got some answers coming in. Thank you, everybody. Now, this is what I don't know. Can anybody see the responses as they're coming in? Or are they just, am I the only one that sees them?
Yeah, it won't let us answer. So
No, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. So then I got to share it with everybody. All right, so I'll give it 3 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, and poll. Oh, I can share results.
There we go.
All right, so ABM, demand gen, both. So my thinking, of course, these are nebulous, right? But here's my thinking. It's hard for organic social media to be ABM because I can't target it to an account, right? So if I'm doing organic social, it's just going out, it's just broadcasting. So I think of it more as a broadcast medium, which is more considered demand gen or both. I also like the answer both. But I did struggle with this one myself, and that's why there's like no wrong answers here. Okay, next one. And Chris, if you have anything to add, just chime in. All right, intent data and activating that intent data. So you get intent data from Bombora, G2, companies that are interested in your category or your platform. And now you want to take that data, you want to activate it in your ad programs, for example, so that you're more relevant, basically. All right, give a couple more seconds here. Thanks, everybody. I like the answers on this one. All right, I thought this was more of an ABM play, but it could absolutely be both. So you could use intent-based data, and then you could take just a slice of people from those and really go after them, or you could take intent-based data and you could go somewhere or email people from a specific account. You could turn it into demand gen, but I think most of the time it's going to be ABM. Intent data comes in at an account level. So you don't know a specific, usually, I don't know, actually, I could be off, but I don't think I am. I'm usually pretty up on this technology. The companies that are interested in your category or your product. And so if it's company data you're getting, then you're going to basically take that and you're going to go and use it in an account-based way. Chris, anything to add on that? But it's also
I think the biggest benefit of treating this like account-based is when we have a pre-built plan, an orchestration plan, a program, a campaign for here's what we're going to do when we see intent. And to the both answer, right? Like we could have intent at target accounts and then intent at accounts who are outside of our target if we have a named list. So we may treat them a little differently based on that, but intent is still intent. So I think that's the underlying thing I would stress here is we want to have something ready to go where we're not in reactive mode trying to say, oh gosh, someone raised their hand. What do we do? Who should call them? We want to have a plan. When we see intent at a target account, this runs. When we see intent from someone outside of the target account, this runs, which is probably option 1 minus a few things.
Nice, I like it. All right, and the last one is direct mail. So I'm using Sendoso, Postal, Alice. I'm doing some gifting campaigns. Yeah, I'm sending fun stuff. Coffee gift cards, DoorDash gift cards, wink, wink. All right, give this one a couple more seconds. All right. So yeah, pretty heavily ABM here. I mean, again, you could do both on this, but most of the time, if you're gifting, you're putting your cost pers up, right? So especially if you're going to do something fun. Now, if it's just like a quick $5 coffee gift card, that's great. That could be demand gen. But if you're getting up there and you're sending like swag and you're, sending out gift cards that are more than $50 maybe, your cost pers just go up pretty dramatically. And so you can't really afford to do that on a high volume side. It's also hard to just execute that on a like super high volume side. So yeah, great job, everybody. I like the answers. Anything else to share on this one, Chris?
I would just say really quickly, one of the things I've learned in the last year and a half, which is I've been zoomed in on high growth SaaS. When I zoom out and still work with high growth SaaS and rest of world, I think that's a lot of the both that we're seeing. Like there are a ton of different types of companies, primarily not technology, right? Like most of us are in B2B that are here, but that is where we see some direct mail that can be for demand gen. But traditionally, we're going to see executive outreach, a send that's happening, then the SDRs are going to pounce on that, or a seller. So yes, I think the audience is pretty well in tune here. Nice.
That's good. Okay, awesome. Well, hey, for those of you who helped me with that poll in the chat, I really appreciate it. We all help each other out, right? Okay, so we're just going to gloss over this slide real quick, but this is really, oh, am I on the next slide? Oh, there it is. Okay. This is just to show you that there's a ton of activities out there, and most are going to be considered in that both area. There are some things that are purely account-based. There are some things that could be considered completely demand generation, but a lot of them are both. Chris, what about this slide? What do we want to call it on this slide?
Yeah, I think the big thing I would stress here, we can usually make the case to use almost anything for both if we're smart about it and if we're doing targeted demand generation. And then the sharing of best practices, that's the most important thing here. So, I'd almost, if I were a designer, right, I would kind of blur these three circles into each other where we have some easier bylines to pull things back and forth, because it's not black or white. It's not, this is only demand gen. We can usually make a case for almost anything that's listed here. And that's the big thing to stress. So, I know one of the things Jason and I have talked about, we're going to grab a couple examples and talk through this, because this is one thing that we really want to stress here. We can make almost anything we do in marketing work across the board for any go-to-market.
Yeah, so let's talk about some examples. We wanted to pull out a couple of examples of like things that you don't see all the time, or that some people might be wondering, like, well, how does that fit into either a demand gen or an ABM program? And so here's some activities that we do as marketers, and we're just going to talk about them a little bit. So events, used to be in person, these huge, big events. I know when I worked at Tableau years ago, it would be 14,000 people in person at these events. And the interesting thing is we always struggled with tying participation in those events to like the actual revenue that it makes, because it's like a chicken or egg thing. It's like, well, do your best customers come to your event, and so of course they're going to renew, or are you get fence sitters coming and you're actually selling them more at the event? It's hard to tell. Now we're in a world of virtual events, which are much easier to pull off. But how do they fit in? So for us, hopefully most of you saw, we announced our big demand event in October. We announced it yesterday. It's in late October. For us, I mean, as a small, 3-year-old B2B SaaS company, why are we doing it? Well, we have okay awareness right now, but we also have a lot of relationships with really good marketers. And we thought, well, hey, let's just build a community. Let's actually take our focus is building a community and supporting the category of demand generation, basically, with as much smart intelligence, and go put on an event that we would want to attend as B2B marketers ourselves. And so what we're hoping that happens with that is that we just get awareness of what is more recent in B2B, what like some of the best marketers are doing, and just gives people ideas and gets them to energize. And then we've got our name associated with it. It's not going to be salesy. There won't be any metadata products, like sessions in there or anything like that. And so that's the way you can do. And we're gonna spend some money on it, but no sponsors. We're not charging anything. So the benefit to us, we're not sure yet. This is the first one we're going to do, but we're hoping that it's big. But it's really that awareness and just trying to build trust and relationships with people that could potentially someday be buyers. Chris, what are your thoughts on events?
Yeah, I think you covered events in a great way, to pull that into account base to make the case for both, right? I've been in many organizations where in-person events, if you were a seller and you wanted to attend, you had to book meetings with key accounts. So literally the metric of do I get to go to the event is how many productive meetings do you have booked with key accounts? What's the expected pipeline? Like, look, we have worked that. We know of exclusive events that have popped up for key accounts. So we can surely pull that into account base, even at big events that are about awareness. Everyone has always known about tracks for certain accounts. Like they get private time with the speaker, private time with the executive. We've seen influencer groups. The digital version of that is very similar. There are breakouts that can happen that are only for certain accounts. There are high value offers that we can run for individual accounts where you get time with the speaker, time with an analyst, whatever it may be. So, events is one. I think there's an infinite amount of creativity we can bring to both digital and in-person events to make it work for what our specific goals are.
Yeah, and I think, just hearing from our sales team here, they absolutely love being able, having something like this come from, the company that they're selling for, because it gives them something to talk to their prospects about, and it's not a salesy thing. It's like, hey, are you coming to our event? Like I'll be there, we can chat, and answer questions. And you're right, we can create these breakout rooms if we want to, even little viewership parties where like the salesperson can be in with their target account list and be chatting about, the sessions going on. So very applicable to both sides, but that's how you can use it on an ABM side. Okay, podcasts. So lots of podcasts out there, a lot of podcasts, a lot of video series. We have one with our CEO, Gil, B2B category creators. So how do podcasts work for advertising? Chris, I want to get your take on that first.
Yeah, I think the knee-jerk reaction for most is to say, this is clearly demand generation, like awareness and trying to get out there and trying to attract a wide audience. But I used to host a podcast. We see a lot of podcasts. Like if organizations are smart about this and someone's running a podcast, even individually, but if they're connected to an organization, usually there is a very intentional reason for some of the guests that they're booking and the conversations they're trying to have. So that can be a way to start to break into key accounts, key influencers, people we wish we were working with, by giving them an audience. So bringing them into our circle. And honestly, that's one of the great things about podcasts. I mean, I was listening to SmartList, which is an amazing
podcast. I love that one. Yeah.
I went back to episode 1, and that's one of the things that Dax Shepard was talking about. He said, I get a better connection with the audience in a podcast because it can be long form. I can tell longer stories. So there are ways to turn that into an account-based tactic if we're smart about inviting guests or the exclusive conversation, or maybe it's kind of a virtual roundtable type thing. There are great examples of that. So I think the big thing I would stress there is there are ways to zig when everyone is zagging, right? Like we can make this work for anything.
Yeah, and I've got a little story that I'll talk about in the next slide of how kind of surprisingly to us, a podcast worked in our benefit. ROI calculators. So this one's a little bit more straightforward. Like obviously, if you've got the data internally where you can build a ROI calculator that makes sense, right? That doesn't show like, oh, just plug in some numbers. Oh, we're going to save you $8 million next year. Like it's got to be reasonable. I think this is a good tactic on both sides, but I think this is a good demand gen tactic as well, because you can get some fairly personalized readout, I guess I would say, for what it might be like for a prospect to work with your company in a massive scale. And so, because anybody can just come to that website and plug in some figures and get a result, and it's a unique quotes result. But again, most of us are running platforms where it's not a simple answer. And to really make an ROI calculator relevant, you'd have to have like 10 to 15 different input data points. And nobody wants to sit there, and they might not even have those data points, that you need to really give them a good readout. And so I go back and forth on this. I want to have an ROI calculator for metadata. I don't right now. We have a lot of data about like all our customers and how their campaigns perform, and all the way down to closed won revenue, because we're attached to Salesforce. But the problem is, when we start working with somebody, early on, we didn't take benchmarks. We didn't ask them, where are you starting from? I mean, we didn't put it anywhere where we could track it. So we started to do that afterwards, so we can actually see, where do people start from when they work with us? And then where do they end up? And then we can use that. And then as soon as we have enough, we can slice it by industry, so that you can come in industry, here's what I'm currently at, and like cost per sale, or, something like that. And they can see what kind of lift they can expect. So that's what I'm thinking about doing with ROI calculator. Chris, have you seen any really good ones, or what are your thoughts on the calculators?
So I'll challenge you for 1 second on that, because I love using this one because it's the default. gated asset, like a great thing that we can gate and bring people into, usually assessments, graders, a lot of the things we've seen over the years, right? They work, they're amazing. The high value offer that I like to push for with an ROI calculator is to say, hey, maybe we have 10 accounts that are our A plus, like our tier 1 accounts. Someone could do account research. It may be an SDR, it may be a seller. Go to publicly available information, start to plug in things that go in the ROI calculator. Let's make it specific to one of our accounts. And then we can prompt the conversation to say, look, we've started to plug in information based on everything we could find online. We may be a little bit off, but we have already identified a couple ways that we should be working together. We know that we can save you money based on XYZ because we've helped Acme Inc. do the exact same thing, and we saw these results. So it's the same construct, the same tool, but it's putting a little bit of sweat and energy into how we can launch that tool. And that's the big thing. Like, let's unlock that way of thinking. And that also speaks to what Jason was saying. Like, we need both go-to-markets, but we also need our true north and our true south. So if we have our highest priority accounts, that makes it easier to say, how can we go from volume into 10 accounts, 20 accounts, 30 accounts, and then we can expand out from there.
I like that. Yeah, that makes sense. And good. Thanks for challenging me. We need a little more challenge in these things. Guides. Okay, so guides, you know, we're talking about this as your ebooks, your guides, your long form content. But really what I'm talking about here is, well, the way I like to think about the really high value ones are, what data do you have as an organization that's unique to you? And can you turn that into something that is incredibly useful and valuable to companies and people who would be your prospects? Because A, you know, they can't get that data anywhere else. And B, if it's valuable enough, it will help them they'll actually help them make some decisions, even without using your own product, that will help them out in their marketing or sales activities. You know, a really good example of this I like to think about is what Gong does with some of the data that they have about what all these sellers are saying on these calls. You know, not just sellers, but everybody in these companies are saying on these calls, and they can get in there and talk about and like analyze with AI and not machine learning, but like transcribing all that content. What are the top words that lead to sales? And you know what I mean? And like objections and all these other things. There's so much rich data in there, and they share that out with their content. And so people get a lot of value from that. We did that earlier this year. We took all of the data we had about our customers' performance in 2020, and we anonymized all the customers. We turned it into industries, company sizes, so people could actually filter through and get a little closer to companies that are like them. And we just released all that data, just raw data, in a data studio report with instructions on how to use it. I was, of course, a little worried, right? Because like, well, what if somebody comes in there that could be a really good prospect for us? But they look, because all of our data is averages, right? It's all averages in there. So like, oh, if they're all averages, you know, somebody might come in and think they wouldn't be better off with us, but we did it anyway. And so it's a high value guide, right? It's a high value guides are really the ones that are going to be, especially the ones on the ABM side, because you're really going to open them up to not only the problem that you're going to help them solve, but then how you're actually going to solve it, but you're doing it in a subtle way. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think I love that. I think that's the perfect way to handle it. Similar to ROI calculator, like, let's take that amazing data that you pulled together and some of those conversations and figure out what is the most compelling 30-minute meeting we could run with that information. So it's akin to repurposing content and atomization of content, pillar content, all the stuff we've talked about for over a decade now, I guess. Gosh, we're getting up there, marketers. But it's taking that same approach and methodology and trying to help it into sales meetings. Like, how can we turn that guide, that amazing ebook, that amazing white paper, that amazing benchmark into a conversation for a prospective buyer? That's how I like to kind of challenge myself and organizations we work with to think about it.
Nice. All right, little story time. This is the podcast story I was talking about. So not that long ago, I was going to record an episode of my show. I don't know what to call it, series, whatever. And I had a specific topic in mind, and I posted it on LinkedIn. I just kind of call for people that might want to come on a panel with me and have a conversation. Chose 3 people based on their marketing experience and their kind of LinkedIn activity. Had recorded the episode, had a great recording. The day after, one of the guests reached out to me. He was like, hey, great, thanks for having me on. We should jump on a call and just talk a little bit more about metadata. I'd like to learn a little bit more. He'd already met with our sales team at some point, before that, but he was like, hey, marketer to marketer, maybe you can help me understand a little bit better of how that might fit. So we met, quick 30-minute friendly chat, gave them some honest advice from my perspective, like, do I think our product would work well for you based on who you're targeting, et cetera. And literally after that call, the next day, he reached back out to the salesperson, re-engaged, and was back into pipeline. And so this is one where I saw somebody put in the chat about inviting guests on who could potentially be in your ICP or you could sell to. We didn't intentionally do that on this one. We may in the future, who knows, because it worked out pretty well organically. But what it does, I just want to talk about the psychology of it. So what happens is, and why this works, is because it's the relationship, it's the trust, right? So if you're hosting a podcast, you probably are pretty good at rapport building. You know what I mean? You know how to talk to people. And so you get somebody on your podcast, you build a relationship with them. And especially if authentically, you're not like, hey, I'm not trying to sell you. I just want to really create the relationship with you. I think we can get mutual benefit from this relationship. As long as you approach it that way, and it's not inauthentic. I hate the inauthentic, like, oh, let's just get everybody in pipeline on the podcast. But it builds that trust, that relationship just builds, and it can build in as quick as that 30-minute podcast or that hour-long podcast, because it doesn't take that long for humans to create that connection, and we just want to hear from somebody else that we trust in our network. And we want to hear that this is going to work for me because you've used it and I trust you. And so that's the psychology behind it, and having somebody on a podcast, you get to talk back and forth with them. You usually do a little pre-interview. So you're spending a little one-on-one time with them. You build a relationship. Where it's also worked out for us, and we didn't even realize this, was with our CEO Gil's podcast, the B2B Category Creators. That one is not for marketers. It's really for company founders and people trying to launch companies on how did you create a new category for yourself, or what did you do when you were placed into this category? And because we're kind of struggling with the same thing. So we literally wanted to launch a podcast based on what we wanted to learn. But what that's done, we've had all these great CEOs and CMOs come on. It creates that trusted relationship. And sure enough, if we get into pipeline, now we have a CEO and a CMO that knows our CEO, and there's that trusted relationship that's built, and it kind of helps us move through pipeline a little faster. It works. It's interesting. I love it. Chris, anything to add on that one?
No, I think that's great. It's a really good example, because sometimes it just happens organically. It doesn't take a sales effort if we're doing the right thing and having the right conversation.
Yep. So we're not going to answer all these questions. If you want me to answer one of these, pop it into the Q&A, but we just want to it's difficult, right? So you're going to have some obstacles. You're going to have some challenges. You're going to have infighting maybe, hopefully not, but between sales and marketing, who owns which accounts? What are we doing outbound versus inbound on these accounts? How do we show that they're both extremely important? So how do you make sure that everybody's if you got a CMO that's saying, we need to go all account based, what can you're going to have a challenge there, because you're going to have to say that's not the right way to do it. And again, we have another slide we're going to talk about. If you're one way or the other, how can you start to tease into the other ones? That makes no sense. You know what I mean? What if volume is held to account-based results? That we were talking about that earlier. What if you're trying to do ABM and you're measuring it with the old way? And there's the one right there. I just said, what if my boss tells me to move to 100% of our efforts? How do we talk about accounts and leads at the same time? There was a question in the Q&A we'll address in the upcoming slide about what happens, in the double funnel, measurement standpoint, they come together, then what do you do? So we just wanted to leave folks with a couple of these questions before we jump into this, which this is the benchmark slide we were talking about. So Chris, why don't you talk a little bit about this? I've got some thoughts too.
Sure, definitely. Feel free to screenshot. I know you'll get the slides, but everybody loves doing screenshots, and I can't see it in person like we do on stages where it's with your phone. But conversion rates on this slide are from real benchmarks, real data. Now, what do we know about benchmarks? It's not as good as your historical data, right? Let's stress that first of all. This benchmark is high growth SaaS, okay? High growth SaaS, fastest growing companies in the world. So it may be a little high in some areas. I'm going to talk through it. The first thing that I kind of glossed over, which there was a great question that came in about this. So in account base, we are focused on accounts, right? We're starting with target accounts. We're trying to create engagement. That's our first measure of success, creating engagement. So you see the 42% conversion rate there. But once we have engagement in an account, shocker, we're talking to people. Like we switch from accounts to contacts. And that's where you see SDR qualified leads coming in. It's quite literally people who are ready to talk to sales. So that conversion rate is where we start to get there, but that's our point of unification. So on the demand gen or volume side, we're always in contact mode, lead, MQL, SDR qualified lead or SQL, opportunity, closed one. On the account side, once we progress and get engagement at a target account, we do switch into talking about the contact. So that's why SDR qualified lead is highlighted there. We're trying to get to they're ready to talk to sales. The biggest point I want to stress here, there's actually two. There's a sneaky one that I'll sneak in here that I didn't talk to Jason about. But the first, if we look at the next highlighted section at the bottom, our opportunity to closed one conversion rate. So for demand generation or volume and velocity, when we surveyed this out, Gartner has done this, TOPO has done this, it comes at 19 or 20% every single time that I've seen it. The benchmark that we have used for 20 years in marketing, just finger in the air, was 20%. So that's literally how it's benchmarking out. We see that. For account-based, it's at 53%. That's a big jump. Now, it's harder to get that engagement. You see that first step, the 42%, because we're going after our highest priority accounts. But that's a huge number. And then one other number I want to call attention to that is not highlighted. So just follow my words on this. I know some people don't love spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. I build a lot of tools, but the lead to MQL conversion rate. So that's 63%. If we circle that with our finger in the air, the 63%, that is for high growth, predominantly SaaS companies, 63%. That is targeted demand generation. The benchmark that I've seen across the world, so not high growth, not B2B tech, not just SaaS, across the world, so counting every industry, I've seen that at 16%.
Wow.
So that's a huge difference where the most sophisticated organizations, even their demand generation is more targeted. It's not let's just cast a wide net. And there was a question about gated versus ungated. Honestly, that's a cultural decision. We see research on both sides. I know some organizations that will gate things until the end of time and they're successful. And I know other organizations that don't gate a darn thing and they're successful. So that there's kind of conflicting data there. Yeah, I see a hand raiser. So
I got strong feelings about that one, but I'll save it to the end if we have time.
That's right. That's right. And then I do see, so a couple of things in chat. The revenue point higher on the demand side to that particular question in chat. So these are just rough input numbers. So the shaded cells, we could change our annual contract value. You can see that there's a lot more demand gen. Honestly, demand gen's getting 70% of budgets when we benchmark that. So I would expect the revenue to be higher on demand gen for most organizations. To John's point on churn rate and churned MRR, I agree. If we benchmark that with this, I think that's going to skew even more heavily towards account-based. And to Ricky's point about spend, that's the number one thing people go into this tool and add, this spend. So spend is really complicated to benchmark. If anyone on this webinar has ever done research, it's really hard to get an adequate spend. We used to track spend per account, so we could start to segment like how much are they spending per account based on their list size. But getting granular data on this kind of conversion benchmark is really tricky. And I'll tell you why, because most people can't actually measure it. That's why.
Yeah. Well, and here's the other thing to think about too. I know they showed the revenue on the right side more, but look at how much more effort there is on the company's part, right? So SDR qualified leads, guess what? There are humans that have to do that. On the right side, they're doing it to 2,333 people. On the left side, 300. So you can have an order of magnitude lower SDR. I mean, I'm making that up, but a much smaller SDR team if you're more on the account-based side. And so that works into the unit economics as well as you work down your way. So that goes into the spend, resources, ROI part of this really.
And we see that. We see specialized account-based SDRs in a lot of sophisticated organizations. They may even sit in marketing. So there's actually close to an even split in where sales development sits. Now, some people don't like to talk about that, but sometimes marketing owns it, sometimes sales owns it. And there was one other question that came in, and you can tell by my energy, like I geek out on this kind of stuff. There was a question about defining engaged accounts. I love that question. You all have asked the right questions. It's the number one thing I get asked, and it is subjective, okay? Defining engagement is subjective. I know Jason will have a point of view on this and how you all do that with your clients. But one thing I will stress, when I talk engagement, so if you were talking to me and you said, hey, Chris, how should we measure engagement? I would say, do they want to meet with us? Like I'm kind of a mercenary with that. Like there are other ways we can track it, but if we're an account base, we're trying to book meetings. That's really what we're trying to do. So I have a higher bar for engagement. When it was defined in this survey, it was, taking meaningful engagement. So it's not an open, it's not an impression, it's not just a click. They're starting to have a conversation with you. But that's a great question, and it does vary. We do see a lot of folks that customize what engagement means to them.
Yeah, and I would definitely caution against using the looser term of engagement of like website visits and clicks, like Chris was talking about, because they are not measures of intent. Like they're not real intent signals. It really is, and that's how we think about it too. Once they show signs of wanting to learn more about the product, that's when that's what we would call an engaged account. So for us, it would be as simple as looking at the pricing page. So that could be something where we're like, okay, maybe, but more often it's a demo request, it's a pricing request, it's an outreach to us, and we're saying, okay, now they're engaged. So cool, I'm gonna keep us streaming through here because of course, like always happens with me, I talk a lot and we get behind. So we're gonna quickly touch on this one. Is it showing up? Why isn't it showing up? There it is. So you can take this and you can then not just do it with the entire funnel together, but it's important to understand how each of your channels fits into and contributes to the performance. And so this is just a view. These are not benchmarks.
Yes.
I will mention that.
These are not benchmarks before everyone rushes in and be like, these numbers are bogus. These are not benchmarks.
Just an example. Yep.
That's right. And I can cover this one really quickly. This is an example, a representative example. The thing that I will stress until I'm blue in the face, I will say that magic happens when we measure any slice of data we can side by side throughout the entire funnel. Okay. This feels simple, but there are very expensive business intelligence tools that will give us the slices of data with drop downs. And the very first time we did this with a client years ago, the very first time we built this particular example, it was a BI tool giving them slices, and they literally had never looked at everything in comparison because the tool didn't treat the data that way. So that's my push. It's to say, this could be first touch, it could be multi-touch, it could be last touch. We should do all three. But any slice of data by campaign, by content, I've tracked it by gated content before, track throughout the funnel, highlight the good and the bad, and then let's have a conversation about it. This is an amazing thing to talk about with your sellers. Like I'll just tell you, if you can show mastery over performance throughout the funnel to say, hey, we're going to change our mix a little bit because we know that we have a ton of MQLs. Like we've loaded up MQLs. Now this is just the volume demand gen side we're talking about now. We would want to be able to say, we know that to get an SDR qualified lead to convert to an opportunity, getting them to the website is going great and hosted events are going great. So based on that information, here's what we're going to do to help our pipeline and opportunities. That's what I'm pushing you for. Like, it's not about the benchmark. It's not about the number. It's about trying to make directional improvements in an incremental fashion.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that too a little bit, if we have time. I'm going to breeze through this one a little bit too, but the important thing to note here, don't pay attention to the visual, it's just meant to confuse you. But the point here is that you can't measure every single touch point that somebody goes through before they buy your product. And in fact, some of the more important touch points, some of the more important things that like get people over that hump and get them to buy are just not measurable. So some of the things we were talking about earlier, podcasts, having a podcast, people listening to your podcast, and just like what impact does that have? That is basically almost impossible to measure that. Word of mouth, like I got a quick story here. You know, I saw a lot of demo requests coming in from our website, and all of them were direct or organic search, brand organic search. And I was like, man, how am I ever going to know where we actually how these people first found out about it? So I just emailed all of them. And I just asked them, I was like, hey, marketer to marketer, wouldn't you also want to know exactly, like you all showed up as direct and I don't know where you came from. How did you first hear about us? 90% of the people that responded to me, it was word of mouth, heard about us on a podcast, heard about us from a friend that uses us. So I cannot stress the importance, and these are some of our best leads because they come through the website. We're not offering them anything in exchange for a demo. They're just coming to the website saying, I see value in your product. Let me take a look at it. Let me take it for a test drive. So just know that we're talking a lot about measurement and specific measurement in here. Use it as a guide, use it directionally, like intuition, knowing that some of the things that you're doing are not measurable, but just having the confidence to know that, yes, this is going to work, but to continue to iterate on that as well, I think it's even more important than getting your measurement completely nailed, because you're just going to miss out on the things that are actually contributing the most to a sale, for example. All right. So you swung too far one way or the other. What do you do now? I will give you, you'll obviously have this slide. I will tell you that both of them start really with experimenting, right? So if you're too far one way or the other, you need to understand what the right mix is going to be. And some of the worst things that you can do is try and put the perfect, best program together and launch it and just wait till it's perfect, because you're going to put a ton of effort in there and you're not going to get it right the first time. So the better way to do it is just get an MVP out there anytime you can. As long as it's an MVP that's not going to detract from your brand, like don't mess your brand up, but do a viable MVP and start to test. And so on the left side, if you're too heavy on demand, really figure out where your ICP is, layer on as much other intelligence as you can on top of that so you can really narrow down and get to the set of accounts that, the way I like to think about it, this way I say it to my sellers, something's wrong with us if these people don't buy our platform. Like we're doing something wrong. They're so right for us that it's our fault if they're not customers. And so that's how you should think about your target. At least that's how I think about it. So of course, that's how you should think about it, but it's just one way of thinking about it. Then test and iterate. But the really thing is you want to make sure you're not going back to the other side. You got to figure out what that right balance is. And there's this notion of an efficient frontier in finance or whatever statistics. And it's where you've got two things that are working for you and you want to find the right balance of both so you maximize your effectiveness, or in this case, you maximize your revenue. And so that's really what we're trying to get to, is what is that efficient frontier where the combination of these two efforts are leading to my most efficient revenue. Anything to add on this before we jump into dad jokes?
No, I think you nailed it. Now we can tell some terrible jokes.
Sweet. Okay, so if you stick around for a couple more minutes after this, we are going to get into the Q&A as well and a couple of takeaways, but let's do some dad. This is the first time I've done this on a webinar, so I love it. Okay, so the point is try not to laugh if you can. All right, I'll go first. Why are B2B marketing holiday gifts boring to look at? Because they only use white paper. All right, Chris, you do one.
Yeah, I didn't have a ton of time to write jokes, but I did do some research. And my 10-year-old, soon to be 10-year-old, he loves I Survived. And I noticed that they actually segmented the people who have been lost at sea by their profession, and marketers were number one. And do you know the reason why?
Why?
Because they can't work with sales.
Yes. Nice. Okay. I'm only going to do one more because we are running out of time, and this is my best one. Okay. Why are ABM platforms horrible actors? Because they're only good at impressions.
Throwing shade. He's trying to start a fight.
You know me, always.
No, that's good. That's good.
Nice. You got any more, Chris?
Yeah, another study, which I'm all in research, right? I was really surprised to learn that a ton of marketers have actually given up football and basketball, and they've embraced bowling. I didn't know if you knew why.
No, why?
Research showed that it was because of the high bounce rate. So bad. These are so bad.
That's the point. Awesome.
Yeah,
okay.
You're going to see in your analytics, you're going to be like, everyone left.
What happened? What happened? Okay, some takeaways. And then we'll try and answer a couple of questions. It's 58. Okay, so measure the full funnel. I mean, measure any slice of data that's possible. But again, don't forget that not everything is measurable. So measure, use it for directionally, intuition, knowing what works, knowing what's going to actually build relationships and trust with people. We talked a lot about good is better than perfect, right? So don't let perfect get in the way of good. MVP everything, put some budget at it, experiment like as much as you possibly can. Chris, take the next one.
Yeah, another one, unify. So we had the song UNITY in our mind for this, but there's an F, not a T. We have to work together between marketing and sales to stop fighting over who sourced what. That came up in chat. That's really important. I love the first two as well. I think the big thing, I want to give you permission to not worry about measuring every single detail, to not worry about having everything perfect, to make directional improvements and tell those stories, right? Like this shouldn't live in a repository or in a tool. We have to tell the stories of how we're getting progress with an account. Like pick one account, tell the story. Jason just did that about the podcast. Like this is a game of stories, communication, empathy, working together, right? Like we want to be able to show mastery of our domain and that we're always trying to get better. So it's kind of permission for that. And Jason, I'll let you bring us home with the last one here.
Yeah, so don't ignore. So I've actually seen this problem of like swinging too far one way or the other completely tank a company's performance. I was there when it happened. It was not fun. And it was so obvious at the end of it what had happened. And so take it seriously. Like we try and get, some entertainment, dad jokes and stuff, but like this is serious stuff, and if you do, and I usually am very like lighthearted about this kind of stuff, but this is one where you do need to get to the right balance because you can really mess up your unit economics. You can spend way too much money and not get the results that you're looking for if you don't find that balance. So awesome. I will go to the next slide just because I want to make sure everybody knows about our event. I talked about earlier on Demand 2021. You can go register there if you haven't already. And of course, it's 1 o'clock right now. We will answer a couple of these questions just for the post recording. If you've got a couple of other minutes, please go ahead and stay on. Let's see, any suggestions for the best way to structure an ABM pilot? What considerations to think about? Yes, so I talked a little bit about this, the MVP. Let me give you a little bit more specifics on that. So ABM pilot, do the account research first. So you don't want to lighten up on that. So you probably want to put most of your effort on that account research to get to like, what are the main accounts that we would really want to go after? And that account list might not change when you move out of pilot. It shouldn't change. Like that should really be where you like their starting point. Because if you don't get off on the right foot, you're not going to really understand through the MVP or pilot how that's going to affect your business. So then you get in and you only take a very small set of accounts. You take a couple of sellers, you take a couple of maybe SDRs, and you just focus them on this account-based pilot with maybe 20 accounts, you know what I mean, to start with. Get them through the funnel, start to look at the conversion rates, and then start to optimize those. In the pilot, you need to optimize because you're not going to get it right the first time. And then optimize those and then figure out what's the best, most efficient way you can get that ABM program running. And then you'll have data to know, okay, where's the right balance?
Love it. I'll add in really quick. Start small, and life is not fair. Pick your A+ players, right? Like work with the best SDR, the best seller, the best field marketer, the best whoever, right? We have to make sure this is successful. So our pilot should be small. It should be dramatically different than Demand Gen and everything Jason said. So I think that's great.
And the last one we'll get to real quick, direct mail is still really, really relevant. I just want to give a shout out here because yes, after the pandemic, the direct mail companies changed. So now they do address verification. So you have to change your strategy. So no longer can you just have things show up at people's doors unbeknownst, which does make it harder, but it means you have to actually work harder to get that, which I think is a good thing. Because I can't tell you how many times I got swag that was just wasted on me. And so I like this new route where you actually, as a seller or marketer, you got to get them on a relationship first before you send them something, and then it becomes part of that relationship. So I like that better. I think that is it. So everybody, thanks for joining. Chris, as always, thanks. Enjoy talking with you. All these slides will be available. We'll send it to everybody that attended and didn't. And the entire thing will be available on demand within the next day or two. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jason.
See ya.
See ya.